I'm the director of the Historic Preservation Program here at Columbia, and we're co-sponsoring this along with the Skyscraper Museum, and I just wanted to welcome everyone. Last night I went to the theater and I got off the train at 42nd Street, and I was rushing westward on 42nd Street towards Theater Row, and I started thinking about what it had been like when I was a student here and was also an avid theater goer to get off at 42nd Street. And I know that there are some people that are nostalgic for certain aspects of the city in the past, but it was nice to walk down 42nd Street and not worry about being mugged. And to see the glitter of all the signs and the dynamism on the street, and it was an extraordinary change from what I remember when I was a student here in the 70s. And I think what'll be interesting tonight is to hear about how a lot of this came about. And a lot of it came about because of interest in preservation, as well as interest in new construction and new zoning. So I think, and we have all the right players here to talk about it. So I'm just going to turn this over to Carol Willis, the founder of the Skyscraper Museum, who's put together the panel.
Andrew, can you turn that off for me? This, which I don't need. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. This is the third of a series of programs that are held in conjunction with our exhibition, Times Square 1984. I certainly invite you to come down to the museum and see that show, or to take a look on our website where you can see the videos that that's a complicated. Thank you. Technical assistance. Thank you very much. I invite you to come down and see the exhibition, or look on our website where you can see every word of the exhibition, as well as most of the images, but also the videos that are sampled here tonight and that we were trying to play in the background in order to give you a little flavor of the time, because those videos from 1984 that were put together by the Municipal Art Society and by Peter Bunch. Does Peter make it yet tonight? Is Peter here? I know he's RSVP'd for the evening. Peter Bunch, who was then a young documentary film producer and was on site for a number of the protests, the Times Square Tower competition panel, a whole series of events in neighborhoods, and as you can see in the little jazz combo in the protest at Times Square, to keep the lights bright, which certainly are today and tonight and forward, it seems, was a protest that brought together architects and civic groups and concerned citizens of all types, stakeholders, many of which are represented, represented here tonight in this kind of spectrum of people who we've brought together, veterans of the battles of the 1980s, to discuss what was at stake at the time and perhaps reflect on accomplishments. The first in the series of programs that we did looked at the role of government in particular, and in this little slide overview that will try to inform the Lion King generation of 42nd Street, rather than those of us who can remember a place that we didn't dare to go as a young woman on 42nd Street. And I think Cora is going to evoke some of the context of 42nd Street back when she began to take over her responsibilities, but a little bit of that can be seen in the slideshow, which, okay, I probably need technical assistance. Is it turned on yet? To go forward. John, is it turned on? Or somebody want to turn it on for me? You're experienced in this.
Yeah, why don't you do this?
Okay, go forward on that. Okay, well, just the... All right. So what I'd like to... a lens that I would like to use in order to explore Times Square tonight briefly in this slideshow is theaters, lights, and skyscrapers. And Times Square is named after a skyscraper. Skyscrapers in Times Square and theaters and signage go together. In 1909, the Times Tower was, you see in a picture here, finished in 1905, gave definition to a district then called Longacre Square that was full of hotels and theaters and various entertainments and signage. In exactly 100 years later, this photograph of 2009 shows the transformation of Times Square in part by the entertainment functions of Times Square and tourism, but by skyscrapers too. It's been redefined by skyscrapers. But if we look back at the subject of the exhibition of Times Square 1984, we can see the process of transformation by which the Great White Way, as we're looking at this bow tie of Broadway that you can see in the drawings of Alex Cooper when Cooper Exton were doing an analysis for the 42nd Street Development Corporation, with the diagonal of Broadway crossing 7th Avenue to define that block of 42nd Street between Broadway or 7th and 8th Avenue that Cora will be and Judith Saltzman will be talking about tonight, and their work there with the theaters, and the theater district, which is something quite different, and our speakers, Jack Goldstein from the Actors Equity Fund, but who served on the Theater Advisory Council along with Lee Harris Pomeroy, an architect who worked for Community Board 5, in order to do studies to think about how to counter the pressures that were being put on the west side by new development. 42nd Street, a little bit behind on my signage, but you can see Paul Siegel, who's here tonight, as a young man in the corner of that couch, sitting next to Carl Weisbrod, who today's planning commissioner, who was in charge of the Urban Development Corporation's 42nd Street project, and the issues that they were looking at, which was cleaning up crime, pornography, violent crimes, muggings, all the things that you see recounted there in the upper right-hand corner, and the XXX pornography, theaters, and the live sex shows that were endemic to that area of the city. So there are really two Times Squares that we're talking about, and the issues of theaters that connect to 42nd Street and Cora's little new victory here, next to a skyscraper that was envisioned for one of the sites on the crossing corners of Broadway and 7th that was part of the government plan, the city, but especially as executed through the state's Urban Development Corporation. So theaters and skyscrapers go together. They go back as far as 1974 in this particular scheme, because we were looking at the Portman Hotel before the new partner, the Marriott and the Marriott Marquis, came together in order to actually build this skyscraper from about 1982 and the construction to 1985 when it was finished. But 11 years before, this scheme was part of an urban renewal project that was conceived under the Lindsay administration in order to bring urban renewal to the theater district. And everything about the architecture of this scheme says urban crisis. It's defensive. It's large-scale, concrete-based. It is inwardly turning rather than outwardly projecting scheme that was a part of the sensibilities of John Portman, where he built this forum in many cities, and was much heralded and praised back in the 1970s when the scheme was welcomed by critics and excited the administration, the city administration. It included within the building a theater. And part of the idea of the Department of City Planning was to save the theater industry by incorporating new theaters, encouraging new theaters, together with the development of high-rises in a rezoning that they planned from about 1980 but was implemented in 1982. There were many consequences of that, and some of our speakers will speak specifically to that point. But theaters and skyscrapers went together in a strategy by the city in the rezoning of the West Side and then the special theater district. And in Lee Harris Pomeroy's drawings for, I think these were the community board, you could see what they perceived to be The threat, which is over on the right-hand side, the existing development to the theater district you see on the left, but what might happen as the towers of 6th Avenue began to march west and replicate on 7th and 8th is the projection of what the new zoning would have allowed back in 1980. So theaters and skyscrapers went together, but there were unintended consequences. The destruction of theaters because of the higher and best use that was being encouraged by new commercial construction. So the destruction of the Helen Hayes, which I know that Jack and Lee will talk about, that you see there, and Lee's project that he'll speak to, that tried to save the theater and somehow mitigate the effects of the Portman even while allowing it to go forward. The protests that came together by producers and actors and a whole range of people, including Joe Papp there being interviewed on the site of the demolition back, I think, in 1982, brought together a series of stakeholders that were, I suppose one might call it mollified or parried by the actions of Herb Sturz and the chairman of the City Planning Commission in putting together the Theater Advisory Council. And some of our speakers are going to talk to that kind of, on the one hand, coalition, on the other hand, conflicting interests that came together in order to solve the problems of the theaters, including preservation, but preservation of the theater industry and the theater business itself, as well as the representatives of the theater owners like the Schuberts and the Nederlanders. So very quickly, the sites that you see in gray at the base of the slide, but on the crossing of Broadway and 42nd Street, show you the sites of the skyscrapers that exist today. These were the sites that were determined, and there you can see them surrounding the little frame of the steel frame of the New York Times Tower, that were identified by the 42nd Street Development Project as the development opportunities where the low-rise blocks of the theaters on the site were upzoned and consolidated around those four corners with the idea, again, that theaters and skyscrapers go together, that the skyscrapers would throw off additional revenue in order to save the theaters. So the money that was created by the sale of the skyscraper sites and the funds that they would pay in from their leasehold profits into a fund would allow for the preservation, the restoration of the theaters, which is actually what happened, but not quickly, and Cora will tell us about that. So here's her little new victory in a skyscraper that was designed for the site. The guidelines that were created for 42nd Street and were held in place by Rebecca Robertson, even as nothing happened for 10 years, but eventually when development did come to 42nd Street in the right economic cycle, and after all of the, I think, 46 lawsuits had been cleared through everywhere up to the Supreme Court, eventually those sites were sold off to different developers, not George Klein and his architects, Philip Johnson and John Berge, who planned these match set of mansarded mega towers that you see there, and that were much despised by the architectural community. Of note, that empty triangle that you see in the models that surround what was supposed to have been Times Square Plaza was the site of the Times Tower. So this plan allowed for the demolition of the original Times Tower, which had already been effaced and reclad with a rather terrible white marble cladding back in 1964. So this was the context that brought together the Municipal Art Society and various other, the AIA and many other groups, in order to try to save the character of Times Square. One of the events was the Times Tower competition site, and this is the poster that announced that. These are some of the winners of the 565 entries that answered the call to design actually a new building for Times Square, not worrying about maintaining or preserving the one that was there, even if it was only a skeleton. David Stein has one of the projects, who's here tonight. And this is what Times Square looked like in probably about with that Times Tower recladding in 1964-65, and you can see how low-rise everything is as you're going down Broadway and entering the Bowtie area. This is Lee Pomeroy's scheme that brought together, that visualized some of the proposals of a range of people that were presented to the City Planning Commission and eventually embraced by city planning to set back the skyscrapers rather than to allow them to rise straight up from the street and create a new canyon that was indistinguishable from many of the canyons of the avenues of New York. So this was a proposal that was embraced by city planning. And then the last topic, a little bit of a jump, but it's all consistent with the idea of lights and signage and protests and preservation. So the preservationists rallied around keeping the theaters, and we're going to hear that story. But there was also this more vague notion about keeping the character of Times Square, the sense of place of Times Square, and that sense of place is indeed part of the historic district language that is written into our landmark law. And the sense of place, people, and you've seen the Municipal Art Society's protests about keep the lights bright in Times Square, looked at and analyzed this kind of character, the ad hoc character of small signs, the collage effect. Analyzed that, these are the Cooper extant drawings that talked about zones of vision and experience from the pedestrian to the commercial to the super sign, all analyzed and then codified in the zoning law revisions of 1987. So from 1984 to 1987, these groups came together like the Theater Advisory Council, like the recommendations to the Department of City Planning, and had protested or brought their displays of what these 20% bonuses were going to look like when they created ever bigger towers. And here there are some MAS folks preparing their model to show it at the City Planning Commission hearing. They succeeded in having these new guidelines incorporated within the law. The role of maintaining signage on 42nd Street, it was something that was overseen by the Public Development Corporation and the state. But on the Bowtie section of Times Square, it was protected by the zoning law. So we have two different mechanisms of government protecting this sense of place. These are some of the models that were created for 42nd Street. Most of these came out of Robert A.M. Stern's office, and Paul Whalen, I'm not sure if he's here tonight, said he might come, was involved in writing the guidelines for 42nd Street, which I think most people think are the most successful part of the plans, of government's plans to save Times Square. But that can be discussed by those who are here. Those are some of the drawings that were made in order to show that. And you can see that this character of the sign, of being angled and small and a little bit and little ad hoc, is a characteristic that was actually mandated and visualized for us by the 42nd Street urban design advisors. And I think you can see that as it continued to exist and even proliferate, mandated by zoning in the Bowtie section of Times Square, but I would add is threatened today. And so 30 years later, we have premiering today, as a matter of fact. The Vornado sign went live today in Times Square. It was already, when I took these pictures last week, it was already being experimented with. It's on the Marriott Marquis. Its expanse is about 80 feet high and 200 feet wide, and you can see it wraps around the corner. But I would suggest that we might even talk, and here's the sign, with smaller signs inset into this giant blanketing wraparound LED sign that you can see. I think I would submit that even in that version of it, you can see that scale really matters, right? That this sign shows you how the symmetry of the experience of that funnel of Times Square has a character on the left, which is being obliterated by the signage on the right. And I hope that this will become a continuing concern of people who want to save the character of Times Square, the sense of place, which is the subject of tonight's talk. So I'm going to let Kent Barwick speak first. You saw some of you saw him in the video 30 years ago, just last week. It was November 7th. He's dressed for the occasion. He's going first tonight, not because he is the most senior representative of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, because he did serve as the chairman, let's see, from 1983 to 1995, and as the president of the Municipal Art Society. I'm not going to invite to introduce everybody, but Kent is the best dressed person here tonight. So we're going to let him go first because, as you might guess, he needs to depart for a fancy affair.
Thank you very much, Carol. This suit was sponsored by Vornado, and it's really nice to be here. It was sort of interesting to be thinking about this over the last couple of days, and I realized there are a lot of stories here, and I'm going to try very hard in the 35 minutes I've been allocated to at least introduce a couple of ideas. But it's great to see people I haven't seen in a long time, like Jack Goldstein, who was the sort of field commander of Save the Theaters, that organized, the troops and the genius behind getting the theater saved, and Cora, Cahan, who demonstrated and demonstrates each season anew why it was a good idea to save those great old theaters and how useful they can be in enhancing and really expanding the power of the talented men and women who weave stories every night, pretending to amuse us, but basically slipping a mirror in front of our eyes. Once upon a time, Times Square was the liveliest place on the planet. There were about 50 legitimate theaters. There were movie houses, and they were sort of anchored on the south by the Metropolitan Opera, and on the north by the Madison Square Garden. And you can just imagine what that would be like when the theater broke and all the guys were coming out of the basketball games or the hockey games, and the swells were coming out of the Metropolitan Opera. What a fabulous mix of things that there were. And in the heart of it all was a kind of a little urban village, our village green in front of the Times building, and that's where people gathered instinctively. I think the intersection of the streets has always gathered people, and that's where people came to either see the zipper on the building, or they came on VJ Day to celebrate the end of the war. They come on New Year's Eve to celebrate the beginning of a new year, or thank God the end of another one. How did Times Square get to be degraded, almost destroyed? How it became the site of this battle to save the theaters and nightlife itself, and now brought to its present state, which later I hope the other people will be speaking about. I'm glad not to have to opine. I think the jury is still out on whether we're celebrating a success or we're still in process, or this kind of intervention didn't work. It was suggested that we start with 1984, but I really want to start a little earlier. I want to go back to the beginning of how Times Square came to be degraded. It was I believe in the 50s, in the Wagner administration. It was an article of faith in New York that eventually Midtown would expand to the west. The west side, Times Square, had, after all, the greatest subway resources. It was land that was adjacent and valuable and ready to go. And everybody from the City Planning Commission to the Regional Planning Association all absolutely established that this was just about to happen. In effect, the city created an expectation that the area would be totally redeveloped. So if you owned a building soon to be torn down, you thought, well, why would you put money into fixing it up? Why would you, if you were looking for, as a tenant for a long time space, why would you rent such a building? So it became, actually, during this brief waiting period, which went on for decades, why not rent to a massage parlor or a pornographic bookstore or somebody, who was marginal, that couldn't complain much, they'd pay the rent maybe in cash, but you could get rid of them quickly. Secondly, Times Square was the movie capital of the city. And it was really not clear to me until we got into learning more about Times Square how significant that was. That the way the subway lines in the city worked was that particularly when the big theaters closed down in Flatbush or in the Bronx or in Queens, that people would come on the subway to Times Square and go to the movies. More first-run tickets, movie tickets, were sold on Times Square than all the rest of the city put together, even as the city was moving to demolish those things. So it had an extraordinary role, but of course the movies were already were faltering, but with television coming in the 50s and 60s and people staying home and watching television, it was believed that there wouldn't be movies very much longer. So over this period of time, says May, I think that there are always unsavory uses or naughty uses that are traveling around the edges of entertainment districts in every great city of the world. But here they began to become more dominant. Finally, in the 1980s, just before the period of our discussion tonight, there had been enormous public outcry and resistance to what was seen as the overbuilding of the east side of Manhattan, east side of Midtown, between the AT&T building and the IBM building. People were very upset about what was happening to Madison Avenue. It was being shrouded in shadows. And the City Planning Commission announced that they were going to downzone the east side. Of course, that got the real estate industry furious, and so then they changed the announcement to say, well, we're going to downzone the east side, but don't worry, we're going to simultaneously upzone the west side. And in fact, they did. And so the city at that moment, having I think engendered the degradation of the area to start with, raised expectations it was going to be redeveloped, stumbled along through a number of projects to try to have it both ways. That's how I would characterize the Lindsay Theater Bonus Project. Finally decided here was their chance. They were going to completely redevelop the Times Square area. The stage was set to create a whole new office district, a larger world of Sixth Avenues. Now, it's astonishing today in our time to think that the city had no sense of the value of what it was about to destroy. And that's, to me, one of the major themes here. And incidentally, a lot of us who were later involved in one aspect or another didn't really have a complete comprehension either. But happily for all of us, people stood up. But Joe Papp and Colleen Dewhurst got arrested, as we saw. Lee Pomeroy stood up and said, wait a minute, you don't have to build the Portman Hotel that way. You can shift it around and you don't have to lose 5 or 6 theaters, including the Helen Hayes and the Morosco, to do it. There are different ways to do it. Brendan Gill raged against the hypocritical war on pornography that the city was really using as the fig leaf to cover what was really a big development scheme. And finally, the Municipal Art Society, which had been pretty much asleep during the Portman Hotel fight, looking the other way, hoping that it wouldn't get engaged. And after all, Times Square wasn't really a landmark area anyway. Municipal Art Society finally, through a variety of people, people like Ming Cho Lee and Hugh Hardy and Tim Prentice, and began to focus on this and say, listen, there's got to be some way to hang on to this place. It's just too important to deal with. And the real fun for me is thinking about the advocacy, and I want to come back to it, but I think the real lesson for me, and I hope for the future, is what we were able, once we started to ask questions, the things that sort of began to come up. One I mentioned, the movies. The movies were thought to be worthless and dead, and by the time we were in action. Most of the sites on the bow tie had been cleared, the old movie houses, and those movie houses were a real loss to New York. They were a real loss architecturally, but they're a real loss culturally as well. Pornography. And you remember the slides that were shown. I've always wondered what a XXX movie was, but thank you. During the question and answer, it would come up. But everybody accepted, oh, yes, well, this is a terrible thing. We've got to get rid of pornography, except for Brendan, who kept saying pornography is life enhancing. But I remember, whether one agrees with that view or agrees with the shocked and outraged posture of the governor and the mayor, I remember we called up. Turns out there's something called the Motion Picture Association of America, the Pornographic Motion Picture Association of America, and you call up and in a chirpy voice answers, Pornographic Motion Picture Association of America, how may I direct your call? And it turned out that what was happening was that while we were busy knocking down the neighborhood to get rid of pornography, technology had changed, and all those middle-aged salesmen from Greenwich that were sneaking into the movies on the way home were now stopping at a video store, buying the movies, and taking it home. So that the exhibition of pornography was declining dramatically at the same time that the home use was going up. So if you just waited, that wouldn't have been a problem. Hugh Hardy did a brilliant thing, which was the city said, well, we're going to save, and this was not easy, and everyone will be talking about it later, the theaters. That was not an easy thing to do, but there's nothing else worth worrying about. And Hugh went around and took pictures of the building directories in Class B, C, and D office buildings, these little 7 or 8 story buildings. And you go into the ground floor, and there's a dirty thing, and it says oh, well, Barwick casting service. That's where these guys were with the pianos and the cigars that were, auditioning the girls, and Goldstein's violin bow repair shop. That's where, when somebody in an orchestra in Times Square, needed an instrument fixed, that's where they went to get it fixed. It turned out that the neighborhood was just filled with these theater-related, under-the-radar screen uses that were crucial to the survival of theater. And Hugh did that with a simple exhibition, just showing those pictures. Jobs. Then turns out that, well, the city's eye was on the real estate industry that was saying, hurry up, and the real estate industry's eyes were on the junk bond business. That's why they needed all that new space. There were actually a vast, huge number of jobs from unskilled labor, including a great number of immigrants. The people that nobody had focused on much until Mr. Strauss-Kahn overstayed his welcome at the, were an enormous economic factor, and people like the woman that he assaulted are not going to work at Morgan Stanley, and they're not, but they do need jobs, and they had them in the entertainment business. And finally, astonishingly, nobody had thought at that time that tourism was an industry. We all knew that real estate was an industry, and the financial services world was an industry, and then all the other industries had been sent packing somewhere. There weren't any other industries. Of course, it turns out now it's a commonplace that we have 51 million visitors a year in New York. It turns out, of course, that it was the second most important economic factor in New York State. But if it wasn't, it was a race to sort of discover the reasons this neighborhood should be changed, even as the struggles went on. Well, the real fun of it, and the fun even thinking about it, is how to get the attention of the public. The mayor and the governor and the New York Times were locked up on these plans for different reasons. They wanted the redevelopment of Times Square and 42nd Street to take place, and they weren't, they weren't going to listen to anybody else. So we did a number of things. I say we, it was a big, by now, a growing group of people, some like the AIA and the Municipal Arts Society, but there were, and the Save the Theaters people, but individuals like Pat Moynihan sort of dared to show up, even though he, and we, as noted, we arranged one night to turn out the lights. That is not an easy thing to do in Times Square. It took about 11 electricians with stopwatches sitting around, but it worked. And when you turned off the advertising lights, the lights we're seeing here, it was really frightening. This was a devastatingly dangerous place in the absence of the kind of activity that it represented. We were able, with the help of the Environmental Simulation Laboratory in Berkeley, to simulate, we built a model from here to the end of that, about 14, 16-foot long model of the neighborhood as it was, as the neighborhood as it would be with the new zoning. You saw someone, Sue Radmer, setting it up in the slide, and then some ideas about what it could be. And we built the model, and it was filmed, and Jason Robards, Tony Hiss wrote a script, and Jason Robards read the script over it, just to show people what was happening. And it was before the internet and things going viral. It was basically a slideshow with a tape, but it had a lot of power. And then we took the model down to the City Planning Commission, the day you saw, and they were furious. They had us thrown out with guards, and we weren't strong enough to lift the model, so the cast of Big River carried the model in. I think Jack arranged it, and but getting them so furious that they threw us out was a big help. Then there was music. How many of you can think of a song about 6th Avenue? There must be one. There isn't. There's not one song about 6th Avenue. Guess how many songs there are about Broadway, Times Square, 42nd Street? It's half a songbook. And so we rented a piano, a stand-up piano. We took it down to City Hall. Kitty Hart agreed to sit up on top of it. People played, and we sang, about giving our regards to Broadway or the avenue I'm taking you to, 42nd Street. And we began to use the music to sort of make the point, because the myth of New York, the myth of Times Square was really tied up in that music. There lots of hard work by lawyers, by architects, by planners, but I think it was getting the public's attention that really changed things. So what's the takeaway from me? Well, the takeaway is I hope Times Square is a real place, and that its authenticity will grow as new people come with new theater ideas, new entertainment ideas, new restaurants, new nightclubs, new hotels, things that aren't slavishly imitating something that's gone. That's the spirit, I think, that came out of the competition. Competition wasn't, as you know, just boards. It was also music. It was a long poem. People really, it was the most successful concept competition in history, with entries from 112 countries or something. But it really, everybody saw it the same way, whether they were looking at the Times Tower or the broader bow tie or Midtown. They all understood what the city government had not understood. What is this place anyway? I can remember picking up a hitchhiker on Route 20 in upstate New York, now under 5 feet of snow today. It was a young soldier. And I had the radio on, and he was listening, and they were talking about tearing down the Helen Hayes and Morosco. This little hick kid from a place called Sharon Springs said, why would they tear down a theater in New York? That's the reason you go there. That simple idea had never penetrated City Hall. So for me, I hope it's been a success. It certainly was a lot of fun, and I think the short range product is better than what it would have been. But for me, the lesson is is one of hubris, is that you cannot intervene with whole sections of the city without trying to understand it, without asking people, without looking at the directories, without figuring out how's the money being spent here, who's employed here, what's going on here, who wants to come here. And the city of New York has now learned that Times Square is a great place and is proud of it. I remember it was a great day when the Democratic National Convention came, and they had put up bleachers outside, and I was sitting up in the bleachers, and Judd Hirsch led the entire, probably 10,000 people sitting there and standing there, and give my regards to Broadway. And I looked around behind me, and it was Arthur Sulzberger, whose paper editorial policy had been against all this thing, and he was teary-eyed, as he should have been. And I said, gee, this is really true. We've come to understand what we had and almost lost. But we still approach other sections of the city this way. Tonight, the Howard Hughes Corporation is getting ready to show its new plans for the South Street Seaport, a place that a totally different set of arguments, a totally different sense of economies and myths and histories and personal beliefs, but still being approached as the same way, as kind of a real estate deal. And we've got to get past this. I hope the reason we're here at Columbia, and hope the people that are coming to the Skyscraper Museum are trying to understand not just the techniques of historic preservation or zoning or architecture or planning, but the techniques of understanding place. Thank you very much.
I'm very glad we have this on tape and that you'll be able to look at it later in streaming video in order to get the richness of ever an advocate and ever an urbanist, Kent. And thank you for those that kaleidoscope of events. And we gave him extra time because he has to leave, so the next speakers are going to go more quickly. But let me just say that Laurie Beckelman is a perfect nexus of theater and landmarks, because after her work heading the Landmarks Conservancy in the 1980s, she, as you I'm sure all know, served as the chairman of the Landmarks Preservation Commission from 1990 to 94, and then after that she became the executive director of the GSAPP Public Theater. So I can't predict what she's going to say about the future, but you can see how rich her past is in these topics.
Thank you, Carol. Well, my fantasy in my life, and I'm not even sure that you know this, was always to work for your husband and Joe Papp. And I finally got some of it. That was my dream when I graduated from university, was to go work for Bernie Gersten and Joe Papp. And I did it years later, but I did have the good fortune of working for Kent Barwick. I started my career in New York as his assistant. And what I do reflect on, and I think Kent is much more poetic than I'm ever going to be, but he really gave you a wonderful history of what life was like at the time. And not to be totally nostalgic, but we really are at a different time when, if you look back, we were trying to save Grand Central. Everybody understood and embraced it. You couldn't trust government. Government wasn't going to help us. And yet again, and then we had Jackie Onassis, and she put us back into the international arena. We'd only created the Landmarks Commission in 1965. I was in high school at the time. Then all of a sudden, we're saving Grand Central. We go to the Supreme Court. And little by little, we were fighting, saving historic districts, individual landmarks we were designating. We were fighting, but we were still a smaller group. But Grand Central, I think, really put us on the map. But then Times Square really changed, I think, the public arena, because as I can recall, for the first time, and Tony Robbins, who is here tonight, who really led the charge at the Landmarks Commission and was in charge of everything, and here he is celebrating his birthday tonight with us, reminiscing again on Times Square, and maybe we'll hear from Tony again afterwards. But it was really the first time that I can recall of saving a major part of the city that didn't only have your passionate, civic-minded people that were preservationists. You also had Broadway stars. You had people that were with the common person, with people that were, Colleen Dewhurst, Joe Papp, Bernie Gersten, others that were coming together. And this did go to the Supreme Court. As a matter of fact, when they started after the demolition of the Helen Hayes, the Morosco, and the Bijou Theater to make way for the Portman Hotel, there was a hue and cry about finally saying, all right, there's Herb Sturz. And I said to Carol, I emailed Carol before and said, you really had to see here what was the climate in New York. People were afraid, as Andrew said, walking down 42nd Street about not getting mugged. People were concerned about New York losing its place of people wanting to come to. We were in a, I wouldn't say a depression, but more of a decline than of being revitalized. And here it was the city upzoning, changing the zoning on the west side, but not really thinking about what is the character, what can we save it. And so with Fred Papert, 42nd Street Development Corporation, getting money from the Ford Foundation, et cetera. But the main people that I can think of that were really leading this charge were Brendan Gill, who we talked about, was chairman of the board of the Municipal Art Society, the Landmarks Conservancy, and this man loved porn. He actually went around the country and testified to some of the porn stars where they were being put in jail, et cetera. And I remember him being the chairman of the Municipal Art Society saying, you can't clean this place up entirely. We have to figure out what the balance is. But what most of you don't know, and unfortunately, and I don't like talking about all of the deceased because they were so phenomenal in so many ways, was Ada Louise Huxtable, because when she left the municipal art, as the architectural critic of the New York Times, she did continue to write. But what most people don't know, and she's not here to defend herself, but I'm living proof, and I think that I got a lot of credit for running the Landmarks Conservancy, and we took very bold steps, sometimes many different and bolder than even the Municipal Art Society, is that Ada Louise Huxtable was on our board. And I would go to her with testimony and also articles and even ads that we would take out in the New York Times that she would write. And she was this quiet force helping lead the charge to save Times Square. Most people don't know about that because she was always behind the scenes because she said, I still want to write, but I feel so strongly. So she and Brendan Gill were quite forceful. We had tremendous arguments with, at the time, Richard Cahan, who was leading the Urban Development Corporation for the City of New York. Most of these buildings that we're talking about were not designated landmarks. I don't know if anybody's here from the Schubert organization, but I used to have the tremendous arguments with Jerry Schoenfeld for years and years and years. And he tried to, once we designated these buildings, try to overturn the designations and go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court wouldn't take the case. And I remember years later when Jerry and I became friends, he'd say, we'll go out for lunch. I said, no, because I will have breakfast with you. Because after half an hour, you start yelling at me. Because you're still so angry that you didn't get your way. And that you're not being, even he said, but we're doing the most wonderful job. Why did you have to take this away from us? Meaning that we were, by designating these buildings. But one thing I want to, Carol had looked at in one of the slides, which showed GSAPP. And when they started the demolition of the Morosco and the Helen Hayes, and this is in 1982, he starts talking about, 9:30 in the morning, there were over 1,000 demonstrators that had gathered on West 43rd Street to hear cast members for Celeste Holm, Tammy Grimes, Treat Williams, Colleen Dewhurst, Estelle Parsons. And then a groan rose from the crowd, but the succession of speakers continued. And the actor Christopher Reeve said, even if they win today, we must never forget how we feel here. And he said it's increasingly a battle between artists and technology. And then they found out at that time that the Supreme Court was not going to take the case. It was over, and they were going to start demolishing the theaters. And GSAPP announced that anyone willing to carry his protest to the point of being arrested should assemble in the adjoining lot, and that's where they were. But they had already made a deal, actually, with the Midtown North Precinct House. On West 54th Street, they were issuing summons for trespassing. So there was already a deal made. You're going to be arrested. We're going to let you protest, and at a certain time, you're going to move away. And that, again, it was the New York Court of Appeals, actually, that the state's highest court that chose not to take the case. And so the rest, unfortunately, is history. But it was after that, and then it was, I remember Herb Sturz saying, all right, well, now we can get on and clean up this place. And then there was more of a focus. But remember, Mayor Koch was there. It was a very different climate. And then I believe that Kent was actually the first chairman of the commission that started hearing those buildings. And we, at that time, started hearing, I think there were 40 buildings, both exterior and interior, that were heard, and then Jack can tell you the rest of the story, but I'm going to sit down because there are many other stories to tell. But for all of you that really are still lovers and passionate about the city, I would hope and encourage you to go back and read some of the pieces that Ada Louise Huxtable wrote. These are all of her pieces that she wrote during this period of time, because they are so brilliantly and poetically written. And what I'm sad about today is that nobody is writing like this. And we really have lost something. Thank you.
I'm going to very quickly read the credits for Jack Goldstein, who I'm just meeting tonight, but whose name I certainly know from my research on Times Square. So he's a founding director and executive director, founding member and executive director of the Save the Theaters, Inc. He worked on the campaign to prevent the demolition of the Helen Hayes and Morosco theaters, and then he spearheaded the successful effort to landmark the remaining Broadway theaters. And he served as the executive director of the Theater Development Fund. I got that wrong before. And he conceived and oversaw the design competition for the new tickets booth when it was new, back then in Times Square, that we all know today. So here's Jack.
Thank you. Thank you. I was asked to provide you with a remembrance of my time in Times Square, and it was interesting for me to listen to Laurie and to Kent, because there was at the time, and there remains, a dichotomy of view about how people approach the preservation of Times Square. And it divides along urban lines as opposed to theatrical lines. And that typified the situation that I found coming as an outsider to New York in 1982. I came here from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which was both the smallest agency of government at the time and also had failed dramatically in its chartered duty to protect the Helen Hayes and Morosco theaters. And I made myself as a volunteer available to the actors at that time for a variety of reasons. For one thing, I think theater is a force for good. I thought it was then. I think it is today. I think there is something incredibly important in that experience of 1,500 people occupying the same mental space with a group of people on stage in an exchange of ideas. Certainly the only theater in the United States of the world isn't happening on Broadway, but Broadway is the cap, the head of the theater community in New York. I like actors, and they have many fine qualities. They were not, and I would guess today still remain, not terribly prepared characterologically to deal with a project that takes a long time. Their entire life is spent going from one project to another project to another project to another project. They take direction for a living. And so in looking at the situation when I arrived in New York, it seemed clear to me that my interests and my talents would be useful to them. The situation was, as Laurie and Kent said, was very volatile. The level of dysfunction was extraordinary. The depth of anger was extraordinary. The demolition of the Hayes, the Morosco, the Bijou, the Variety, and the Gaiety theaters, there were 5 theaters on the site of the Marriott Marquis. Only 3 of them were in legitimate use at the time. There were 5 historic houses on that site, 2 of them extraordinarily important, both architecturally and in terms of their theatrical history, the Morosco and the Hayes. But the destruction in the center of Broadway of beloved, important, and from the actor's point of view, irreplaceable instruments of their art form and communication was an affront that they were incapable of understanding and not prepared to deal with in the long term to prevent it happening again. And also at that time, and I think Cora would know, I have my peace of mind withdrawn from the theater community a bit. But at that time, it was a small world in the theater community, and people's careers were on the line. You had a very few powerful people who were sometimes producers, sometimes theater owners, sometimes both, who controlled people's careers. And so for an actor to stand up and to publicly disagree, no matter who the actor was a difficult thing to do. And so, and mind you, producers are every bit as emotional as actors are. The entire business involves a kind of focusing of emotion and a collaboration of emotion. So whatever you do on the outside, once you get on stage or backstage, you have to talk to your fellow members of that collaboration. So it was a devastating situation for the actors. And so I, for my own purposes, narrowed my interests, if not my interests, my activities, to making sure that there would be no more theater demolitions. For me, more than the signs, more than the bowl of Times Square, more than all of the urbanistic issues, for me, the major goal, my primary responsibility in keeping faith with the actors was to make sure that there would not be any more demolition of those theaters. Now, the most effective and expeditious way to do that would have been to seek a historic district in the center of Times Square, covering what later became in zoning the core district. But it was not going to happen. Kent was the chairman of the Landmarks Commission. Mayor Koch would simply not allow a historic district to be imposed in the center of what was to be the new development area in Times Square. And so we were forced to enter into a very complicated process of individual examination of each of the theaters, interior and exterior, which we undertook, and there were many people who helped. Kent mentioned some, Laurie has mentioned some. This was a group effort that I don't think has been equaled in terms of the numbers of people who played an active role in a positive one. The Community Board, Community Board 5, did the research on every one of the theaters. I helped facilitate the presence of well-known actors at hearings and the like, and they brought to it a personal and intimate knowledge of these buildings, which they had, but the Community Board did a lot of the groundwork, making it possible for the Landmarks Commission, which was going to be sued, no matter what, it was going to be sued, made it possible for the Landmarks Commission to, within its own standards and according to its own measures, designate the majority either interior or exterior. It was a tremendous amount of work. And in order to make that possible, we had a job of familiarizing the Landmarks Commission, the public, government, with what made those buildings special. And Hugh Hardy was invaluable in that as well. We collaborated on a study that explained that in those theaters, from the actor's point of view, there was much more going on architecturally than the surface decoration. In fact, the surface decoration was merely the external manifestation of spatial relationships and building techniques behind the walls that produced the ability to communicate, and at that point, without a microphone, even in the largest theaters without a microphone, to communicate at a whisper with up to from 600 to about 1,400 people. So a theater like the Morosco, which was on its surface a simpler piece of architecture than the Helen Hayes, was in fact, in terms of the importance of its architecture as a theater, as an operating theater, the Morosco was far more important to the actors than the Helen Hayes was. And so we needed to, for the purposes that government could understand, we needed to put these values into terms that they could accept and support and defend, as it turns out, defend, as we knew it would. Jerry Schoenfeld has been mentioned before. He was an outsized personality. He wasn't the only one. The business was filled with outside personalities. And very often his gestures overreached his own interests because he was not used to having decisions taken out of his own, his own hands. But I met with him very early on and shared with him my view that he was wasting his time and wasting the time of his fellow owners and wasting the time of the producers who all joined in the lawsuits, which were very expensive, because the point of view that these theaters did not meet the criteria would not prosper. And so I asked him if he would take a step back, accept the reality of that, and let us move on with the other important pieces which we did agree with, which were basically endowing the theaters with a source of income that did not require the demolition of those theaters, giving them access to their real estate values, and making theatrical production the highest and best use for the properties. We eventually got there, but not until after the landmarks designation took, I think it was, the theaters were finally designated in 1988. I think it was almost the 90s, or maybe it was 88 when the Supreme Court denied cert on the case and the designation stood. At that point, we then began working on the other aspects, which were not universally supported by the public interest community. The extended transfer of development rights for the theaters. We had to fight very hard from within the theater community, right, time. Let me just say, because Paul Siegel's in the room, that, and it was mentioned before, the Theater Advisory Council was set up by Mayor Koch through the City Planning Commission as a way to mollify many of the parties that were involved. And Jennifer Rabb, who is currently the president of Hunter, who was at Herb Sturz' office, and who later I came to know on the community board, told me years later that there was a certain amount of humor with which the actions of the Theater Advisory Council was greeted. Let me just say that the Theater Advisory Council, which was made up of all of the antagonists, met 51 times, came up with a consensus report, was accepted, and if you look at that report, you will see that essentially everything recommended in that report eventually was enacted to the betterment of the preservation of the theater district. So thank you.
Thanks, Jack. You can all see how rich and complicated this menu of government, and the words came to me as Jack was speaking, and all of our speakers, they are at the same time realists, strategists, and idealists, all at the same time. We're running desperately late in order to get everybody in. And Lee has just said that he's going to be very brief. Lee Harris Pomeroy was involved, and as you can see, has been mentioned in the particulars of the scheme that he did in order to try to find a resolution to saving the theaters and building the Portman. But as I showed you in some of his earlier drawings, also for Community Board 5, very early on engaged in the analysis of trying to think forward what the implications of the zoning law would be if things continued as they appeared to. So Lee's going to talk briefly about the particulars of the Portman case, I think, and then we're going to go to shift gears quickly to 42nd Street and Cora Cahan and Judith Saltzman to talk about the theater restorations there.
Thank you. My voice is not very good, and many good things have been said already about this part of the process. But the drawing that's up on the wall there is kind of a diagram that reflects the significance of the Portman Hotel at the time it was proposed. It was kind of like an isolated opportunity for the city that it had of Times Square with pornography and empty theaters. The Portman Hotel was believed to be a very important way for $300 million and 2,000 hotel rooms to change the very nature of Times Square. So the city was very interested in this from an economic standpoint, as well as because something had to happen to clean up the social activities that were not considered so desirable, and others have spoken well about that issue. On the other hand, John Portman came to New York with an investment opportunity, and his background from Atlanta is quite apparent in the design that he produced for Times Square, as he's built so many atrium-sponsored hotels that are kind of standalone buildings. Now, before I get into that part of it, I did want to say that the extraordinary way that I came about working on this project was because I was on Community Board 5, and there were, as Jack pointed out, so many extraordinary people that were involved in this cause that we were kind of just carried along with it. Also on Community Board 5 was Bobby Hanman, whom some of you may know. Bobby Hanman was an extraordinary personality who not only was involved with Community Board 5, but her husband was head of the American Place Theater, so she had ties into the theater industry, and she was encouraging some of us to work on this project in any way we could. And the other person that tremendously important that hasn't been mentioned yet today, but is Joan Davidson. Joan Davidson was kind of like the generator of all of our efforts to work on this project, and the Kaplan Fund invested heavily in this process with the legal battles that went on. Cost a great deal of money. The architectural part did not, but that Joan lived with this project all through the entire process, including going to Washington and trying to deal with the designations and legal issues that came about later. So with that in mind, I was given just a very simple part to this project, or not simple, but specific. Somebody asked me whether there was a way to build the Portman Hotel and save 2 historic theaters. So I had to answer the question, and that took some work to do. But the answer to that question was that it could be done. And but to get to that issue, I think I should go beyond here a little bit. How do we do this? Yes.
Try using that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There.
Okay. Right. So the Portman Hotel was an iconic structure that had a form, and strangely enough, I noticed Alex Cooper was talking about design guidelines with last week, and didn't think that Philip Johnson was interested in such things because he was the designer. Alex Cooper could have done a lot with this building. I had this strange situation with this, that is, in order to try to get the theaters saved, it was necessary to follow Portman's design ideas and actually protect them. On the other hand, there was great temptations, as most architects know, to make changes to the design. But we were trying to prove that it could be done, and Portman could have all of the aspects of his project. And all those aspects involve a large ballroom, the theater that he got bonuses for, the new theater, the 2,000 rooms and the atrium that he's famous for, even though an atrium on Broadway, one might think is not the best kind of hotel. The tradition in New York is for hotels to relate to their street. There was a 5-lane highway in front of this building to get to the entrance, and the elevators were way in the back. On the other hand, I had to live with that problem.
I'm going to advance it for you, and you keep talking.
I'll do it if you give me that.
But you have to talk faster.
Okay, I'm going to talk faster. So here, the great Helen Hayes facade, and a great architecturally interesting building, and the Marasco building, which is most important because of the wonderful careers that it salvaged or produced. Out of that, I'm going to go much quicker here. We redesigned the entire format of this building, even though it looks more or less the same. We turned it 180 degrees and put 2 theaters into it and built over them and put the ballroom over it, but the entrance to the building changed radically. And if this design were produced, you would enter right off Broadway, and that this allowed an emphasis on the back with Schubert's alley and things of that nature. And I'll just run through them because there's a lot of design things that have happened here to keep his building but provide the change. This drawing, I believe, was produced at Columbia here, actually, a long time ago. So I think they have credit for this rather beautiful drawing. And we were glad to suggest that it be set into the building in this fashion. Now, from this, there were all kinds of legal issues that came up. Not only were we trying to get the building saved, but we were trying to do it in a legally acceptable way when there's all kinds of lawsuits and an EIS statement involved. So I'm going to go through. I'm going to let it go that way. Okay. Okay. I'm going to do it. But then we'll let it go there. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, I'm introducing Cora Cahan, whom I think has already gotten quite a lot of kudos this evening. She served since 1990 as the president of the 42nd of the new 42nd Street, which is a not-for-profit formed by the city and the state to address the 7 theaters on the block between Broadway and 8th Avenue. And of course, she is her 42nd Street baby instead of Broadway baby is the new Victory Theater for Children, which is the first among equals of this extraordinary effort to save theaters on 42nd Street.
Can you put the slide with the old 42nd Street 1986 slide of the north side of the street? I'm going to put my stopwatch on, if I can. Start. Okay. We have 5 minutes. That's what we're supposed to have, 5 minutes? Okay, I'm going to do it in 5 minutes. I talk really fast. I'm from Brooklyn. But I live in Manhattan. I'm sorry. I went to school on 46th Street, so I was getting off on the 42nd Street station for several years. I came to work in 1990. This is 1986 on the north side of the street. You can look at the new Victory Theater and read what's on the marquee. I actually can't see it from here, but I do see the XXX porn sign on it, and I will not read what was playing there out loud because I might get in trouble. This is a university, so you can read it to yourselves. I came to work in 1990. I had been in the dance world. I had run a dance company, a ballet company. We had built a theater called the Joyce Theater on 19th and 8th out of an old porn cinema. So I think Carl Weisbrod thought maybe I understood something, which I did not. I did not know what an EIS was. I had to find out what that meant, and I never read one. So I come from a very different world than all the veterans who went through the wars before me. I, for the first time in many years, feel like the new kid on the block standing here. I have 4 more minutes left. So skyscrapers and theaters, absolutely, Carol. Skyscrapers and theaters. The whole plan that Carl Weisbrod and Herb Sturz and others came up with was to hire me to be the president of a brand new nonprofit organization that was going to be responsible for 8 of the theaters, actually, on 42nd Street. There were 9 at the time I came to work there. Today there are 8, and that's another story. We won't tell it. The idea was that the buildings on the corners were going to go up. This was after the condemnation of the 42nd Street Development Project, not the Development Corporation. That's Fred Pappert and Theodore Rowe. This is the 42nd Street Development Project, a city-state economic development project that was the largest city-state economic development project until the 9/11 tragedy in the city, when that project downtown became larger than 42nd Street. So I came as the first president of a brand new organization called the 42nd Street Entertainment Corporation, and a woman named Marion Sulzberger High School agreed to be chairman. Carl got me to say yes, Herb Sturz got her to say yes, and there were a board of about 30 people who agreed to come on board to try to figure out what to do with the theaters on 42nd Street, and that was what we were given. I call that a negative dowry. And we paid $10 a year for the 8 theaters we're the landlord of on 42nd Street. The idea was that the buildings were going to go up on the corners, and we were going to stand out on 42nd Street with our hands out like this, and people were going to give us money for the theaters and tell us, and the one that got the highest pile of money would get the theater, gave us the highest pile would get the theater. That is not what happened. What happened was the theaters that made 42nd Street at the turn of the 20th century remade the new 42nd Street at the turn of the 21st century, because those buildings did not go up as planned in 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 97, 98, 99. I think the first one actually that happened, ironically, was the Condé Nast building owned by Douglas Sturz, who, of course, had sued the city and the state for years on this project. So that was the irony. He will soon have an empty building, and he will probably fill it up again. So what we did was we had operating money from the Portman Fund. There was money for the theaters on 42nd Street put aside by the Portman Fund. So we had enough money to pay my salary. I was the first employee. Soon there were 5 of us. And there was $18.2 million from the developers of the erstwhile Park Tower development on the 4 corners. So we had $18.2 million set aside for the renovation of 2 of the theaters for nonprofit use, 2 of the sites for nonprofit use, I should say. So we took, I think, $9 million of the 18.2, $9.2 million of the 18.2, and we said, we're going to do something on the street that no one's going to believe. We are going to make a theater for kids on 42nd Street called the New Victory. We also renamed ourselves. I'm sorry, I forgot to say. We were the 42nd Street Entertainment Corporation. The first action by this brand new board, who knew not why they were there or what we could do, was to change the name from 42nd Street Entertainment Corporation because of the kind of entertainment associated with 42nd Street. And we changed our name to the New 42nd Street, thinking if we were lucky and maybe a little bit smart, it would be a new 42nd Street one day if we could bend any of that real estate in any of the city to our hopes and aspirations for the street. So the first thing we did was take $9.2 million of the $18.2 and create a theater called the New Victory. It is now 18 years old, or will be on December 11th, 18 years old, to fill a void in what we thought was the cultural fabric in the city. Here we were the theater capital of the world. Here we were in the Broadway district, Times Square, crossroads of the world, and there was no theater dedicated to kids, their parents, and their schoolmates in the theater to help inculcate a love of the theater on 42nd Street or anywhere in the city. So here we have this theater. Today there's a show there from from all over the world, actually. 2 weeks ago, we had an opera, The Magic Flute, from South Africa, and soon we have a Chinese circus for the holidays. So the theater of the New Victory was established with 50% of that 18.2. The second thing we did was say we want to make a place for artists, and we built with Charles Platt and Plattmeyer Dovell and now White, a rehearsal studio building smack in the middle of the block, which has won lots of prizes for the performing artists of the 20th and 21st centuries and for the spells they cast. And today there are 14 rehearsal studios. It's 15 years old. We have also offices for nonprofit dance and theater companies in the building, and we serve primarily nonprofits who pay the lowest rent for these beautiful rehearsal studios because we knew what we were doing, but the building is subsidized very largely by the use of those studios, those same studios, by Broadway plays and musicals who pay the highest possible rent for leasing rehearsal studios. So, I mean, we've had every single Broadway show that's open so far this year in our studios with all those stars that have been rehearsing. Right now, actually, we have Robert De Niro, who's directing a musical based on the Bronx Tale. Is that a film? Is that a film? Yeah, based on that film. So Robert De Niro, who's never performed on the stage, is directing a musical. So all kinds of things happen. It's actually a very vibrant, fully booked. We wanted to build 2 more floors on that building. The city and state, or 42 DP, would not let us. They saw the building when it was completed, and they said, we should have let you build it higher. And I said, never say that to me again, or I will wring your neck. Because today we really could use 2 more floors and 4 more studios in that building. We're turning people away. Hugh Hardy designed the Victory, and actually working on a redesign of our lobbies, which are sort of just generic right now with Hugh. When Michael Eisner came to the street, we were the intended landlord for the New Amsterdam. I took Michael through with Bob Stern. When Michael said, who should we hire as an architect to do this, because it wasn't going to be Bob, I suggested they hire Hugh Hardy, because he would take his tie, throw it over his shoulder, and he would persuade Landmarks. It was Laurie at the moment, I think. Yes, 93. It was Laurie at that moment. Soon it was going to be Jennifer Rabb, just to name names that have been mentioned here. But Hugh was hired, and he got 200 seats where you weren't supposed to have 200 seats in the New Amsterdam. It is a federal, state, and local landmark. Let's go to the slide today. Well, you know, if you have the New Victory old, the New Victory new, you want me to do that, Judith, before you get up there? Yeah. Oh, okay. That's the street about a year ago. You will notice. I'm going to walk. Above my head, you see the multicolored light lit building. That's the Plattmeyer Dovell rehearsal studio building. I won't tell you the story about my argument with Robert Stern about that being a sign. It didn't qualify as far as he was concerned. It qualified, and we got it. Qualified because I argued that it was a sign, it was a symbol of change and light and nothing being permanent. Right next door, there's a kind of a blur. That is the one theater we have not leased. We've had 2 tenants over the last 10 years. They both paid rent. They both went under, so it's for lease now. And Judith, you want me to show the New Victory, old and new, before you get up there? You have the New Victory. That's the New Victory. Oh, that's the New Victory when it was the Republic in 1902. It was built by Oscar Hammerstein, the grandfather of the lyricist. He got in trouble financially, as it was his way, and Belasco took it after that. It became the Belasco. Belasco enclosed the steps, and he simplified the interior. Judith will talk about that. And the Victory today with the Belasco staircase looks like, got the Victory today? You have another slide of the Victory? That is not it. That's the Victory when we found it, actually. Yeah, this is the Victory today. If you go back one, that's the way we found it. That was it when we found it. That's it. No porn, no nothing, just deteriorated facade. No steps. Minsky, it was Minsky's Burlesque. And Minsky sheared the steps off. And today, it's a theater filled with kids. That's it. Thank you very much.
And it just said, oh, okay. Okay. Hi. Well, I'm Judith Saltzman, and Lee Saltzman Architects started to serve much later than everyone else here in 1995, working for the 42nd Street Development Project. And these theaters on 42nd Street, with the exception of the New Amsterdam, were not landmarked, but they were calendared, and a specific means of controlling and administering the preservation requirements was created. And we basically worked with a representative of the Empire State Development Corporation, one of the New York City Economic Development Corp., and the Landmarks Commission to make sure that these preservation requirements in the midst of this demolition and development were adhered to, and they were quite stringent. As Cora just showed, this is in the process of the New Victory. The interiors were controlled, exteriors, specific items, the use in a certain sense related to entertainment uses, and here you see the construction, recreating this monumental stair, recreating the missing cornice, and also very much working with Robert Stern's office on the lighting and signage guidelines. So you really had preservation guidelines and lighting and signage guidelines that had to work together to create something dynamic and new with a concept of new entertainment on 42nd Street. And this, I have to say to Cora that, the New Victory was the first. It was the oldest theater on the block. It was the first project, and it is truly an extraordinary experience. It is a beautiful theater inside and out, and what happened here? And provides, really, as she said, a critical experience for the youth of New York in the theater world. And as you can see, Arputi at the top of and Hugh Hardy did the project. There were many different approaches to the projects, many different ideas, all of which had to be reviewed by the committees. This is the Lyric Theater on 43rd Street. The major facade had this beautiful facade, but there was no actual interior. There was an incredible interior to the Apollo, which linked to it, and the idea was they took two different theaters and created a new, larger theater that could meet today's standards for production and back-of-house space, et cetera. And so this building was actually, if you can see here, just the facade remained on the street. There was actually a facade and a hole in the ground behind it. The lights are little. And to the point, yes, to the point where I was standing on the street, there was a enormous hole in the back. There were two people came up to me with tickets to Ragtime, and they said, well, we have tickets for Ragtime. And I said, well, the theater isn't even built yet. We just have the facade. And they showed me the tickets. They were from Ohio. It was for the next year. And indeed, I assume they came back a little. But it was quite an extraordinary experience to create an entire, as you here you can see, an entire new theater behind the facade, carefully working with artists for the recreation of ornament. The dome of the ceiling was completely, it was like a pie. It was dissected. It was brought down. It was restored. It was enlarged in another ring and put back together. Iconoplast Design did this. The plasterwork, it was really the level of craftsmanship and meticulous decorative painting, plasterwork, woodwork, masonry that was brought back to 42nd Street in the course of this, of these theaters being restored and adaptively used, is really a critical part of the preservation of the street. And I think this was Creative Time who did right before the project began in terms of demolition. There were the marquee signage.
Well, that actually was a sign for a play.
That one was, yeah, but they did a...
Jenny Holzer's
yeah, right, right. And so there was, at the very beginning, so this is Fiona Shaw playing in the Wasteland. This is the Empire Theater on the right, which was originally the Eltinge. It was built at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was named for Julian Eltinge, who was a very famous female impersonator. And the theater was actually moved, which I'll show you, but if you go into it today, and you take the escalator through the proscenium arch to go to one of the movie theaters, and you look up, you will see a classical scene with a woman and Corinthian columns and so forth, and they based
on our research, they all appear to be Julian L. Tinge. So, a little known fact. So this theater was actually moved down the street. It was not required to be moved down the street, but the developers were required to maintain the theater and decided that the position would be better. This was quite a feat of platforms and hydraulic rams and tracks, and the theater was moved approximately 170 feet. If you look on the top right, they show it at the beginning, but the theater under the tarp is the Liberty Theater, also restored. We had moved the theater 30 feet the week before because we were too nervous to have the governor and the mayor and everyone there as we were about to do it. And this was part of Bayerblinder Bell, where the architects for the project here, as this theater was moved down the block, International Chimneys, who said moving a theater which was low and blocky and was easy because they're used to doing lighthouses in the sand and urban foundations, carefully, meticulously created a system to move this. And if you walk down the street today, the building was moved horizontally, but 42nd Street actually slopes down toward 8th Avenue, and you'll see it's set on a new plinth, and there is a sign there that tells you the history of the move, and you can see the difference in the elevation literally on the street. And there it is today, and there's a bit of the palimpsest world and collage and various other items we've heard today here in the design, where there's preservation, there's development, there's a certain corporatization of the street in the midst of the preservation, and I think there are successes and failures here too, and I think. In some ways, there's this enormous amount of preservation that went into it, and it may be in some ways difficult to actually discern on the street. So I think it's important that we look at that history and see where it really was successful. And thank you for your patronage.
I'm not going to sit here. Why don't you all speak, and perhaps, yes, terrible question, urgent question here to pose.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much all of you for coming. Thanks for the, sorry, oh, hello. Oh, that's much better. Oh my. Thank you all first of all, very much for coming, and I've learned so much this evening. So this might sound a little controversial, but I think I'm going to ask it anyway. And just important to keep in mind, I'm speaking on my own behalf, and I'm not saying that I agree or disagree with the following statement. I just like to get your reaction. And I wanted to write it down so I did make sure I got it right. In his in-depth study, Reconstructing Times Square, political science and urban planning professor Alexander Reichel argues essentially that development advocates exploited historic preservation and the theater arts and their appeal to the values of upper middle class New Yorkers who were often hostile to urban renewal to include this demographic in a pro-growth coalition whose true motives were the sort of taking back of this space by higher class commercial interests and the routing of a lower income but nonetheless racially, culturally, and economically diverse population from the city's central entertainment area. And I'm just wondering, and I'm putting this out for anyone who wants to answer it, do you agree or disagree with Mr. Reichel's thesis, and why or why not?
I couldn't follow all that. Honestly, I just couldn't follow all that. Can you say it in a nutshell instead of reading all that?
Oh my goodness.
Well, that's the challenge to you, but I don't know how to answer a question I didn't understand.
In a nutshell, he was saying it was all about chasing out poor people so rich people could reclaim Times Square. That's basically what he said.
Thank you.
And preservation
played a very significant part of that and was used as a vehicle for facilitating.
Well, I would disagree.
What they said.
I would disagree with that. Not perhaps in that happened to some degree. Although I think if you walk down 42nd Street today, the fears that people had that it was going to be sanitized, I think, have not proven true. It is a very diverse crowd on 42nd Street. It is a very diverse crowd in Times Square. It's far more diverse today than it was in 1982. But in a way, it is an interesting academic question that is moot in terms of the realities of the situation, because the decision to encourage the high-density development of Times Square was made long before the decision became necessary to preserve the theaters through a preservation movement. The plans to develop Times Square were explicit for almost a decade. Laurie mentioned Ada Louise Huxtable and showed me before we began tonight that in 1973 she wrote an article that described in detail the plans for the Portman Hotel, the demolition of the Hayes and the Morosco theaters, and the city's desire to recapture Times Square, yes, for high-density development. That was a city policy that had been established and approved and endorsed and promoted, and then catalyzed by the city's application to the urban development, to HUD, for a specific grant to build the Portman Hotel. It was the destruction of the theaters based on that pre-existing city policy that catalyzed the preservation movement. And had we not responded in that way, we would be looking now. Kent mentioned there were 50 theaters in Times Square. There were 100 theaters in Times Square at its height that ran from 39th Street to Columbus Circle. And we had lost one on average every 4 years since the war. And so we were down to, and I say we, I mean the American people, not just actors, we're down to a very small collection of theaters, 7 of which were identified by their owners repeatedly as not economically viable at that time. The Belasco, the Court, the Longacre, which we had to forcibly prevent from being turned into a community court because it was not economically viable, and yet the Longacre as a 2-balcony house now is extremely viable. So the forces at work in Times Square were thoughtless in terms of the impact and the values of the materials there. And Kent pointed that out. The city did not understand what was valuable about Times Square. And we had to make that argument. And as I said, we looked at an agenda, and the first piece of that agenda was to simply put a stop through whatever legal remedies we had to the further demolition of theaters. So whether or not that somehow facilitated that high-density development, it wouldn't matter to me if it had, but it didn't. It was in response to that high-density development.
Tony Robbins, because it's your birthday and because you were involved in all of this from the landmark side, and you translated that particular perspective, would you like to comment?
About the question?
About landmarking the theaters, I suppose. Not about the question, but in general about whether you agree or disagree with the presentation.
I was the deputy director of research at Landmarks, and our job was to go out and research the theaters and figure out which should become landmarks and which shouldn't be. We took photographs of them. I was in every single one of the 45 theaters that we heard, with my photographer taking pictures. We tested the acoustics. I recited Jabberwocky on every single stage. I believe I'm the only person who has ever recited Jabberwocky at every Broadway stage. Very proud of this. During the research, we had to go into the 42nd Street theaters. And the owners, we called the owners of the theaters and said, can you please arrange for us to come in when there's not a theater?
What time of the day did you get in there?
And they said, I'm sorry, we don't want you here. If you want to come in, you'll have to buy a ticket like anybody else. I said, okay. So we went, I think it was 10 in the morning, and we walked into all of them, but the one I remember is walking into what is now the New Victory, which was the nastiest of them all. And anybody who thinks that there was anything life-affirming going on in there just doesn't know what he's talking about. We tried really hard not to look at the screen because it was so awful. I was there with a female colleague. We tried to take notes. It was, picture us, two young earnest landmarkers looking at, oh, look, there are putti up there. God, don't look over there. Look, there are putti up there. Let's make a note of it in the dark. And then my colleague sat down for a minute, and then she screamed because she'd sat in somebody's lap. And everybody jumped up, thought it was a police raid. And we left and had a stiff drink. And the idea that that place is now gorgeous and a children's theater is such a miracle. I can't, and thank you for doing it.
Well, I'll just tell you that we went, if I can speak for an hour and a half, so that was really hard for me. But I would hear myself say over the years, we went from people pushing drugs, and those were the poor people. They were in the parking lot, which is now the SJP building where Proskauer has their offices. So we went from people pushing drugs to folks pushing strollers, and that absolutely happened. The problem we have on 42nd Street now is we have too many pedestrians on the block. The overriding public goal when I came to work there, and I heard about a public goal for the first time in my life, was to get people on the street. And now we actually have people not only in the street, but spilling over into the bus lane and spilling over into the traffic lane. So that's another issue, and I'm not going to go any further on that comment.
I've been told.
I'm sorry if I stopped.
Yeah, but I'm told that there's an official end to the evening by the responsibles here. But I think even though we may be kicked out of this room, we can probably still occupy the public space of the immediate lobby and continue the conversation for anyone who still has questions. But we thank you so much for coming tonight. We're sorry that we didn't have more time to include such interesting comments.